Today, a very interesting book is called The Unromantic Orient. Now, in the spring of 1922, a young Leopold Weiss received a letter from his uncle to come and live in what he called a delightful old Arab stone house, where, in Jerusalem, in the fringe of the old city, he sets out on a foggy morning in 1922, standing on the side of a ship about to embark to the east, where he'd first experience the Arab world, first experience the Middle East with all of its variants, colliding cultures and peoples and landscapes. He says about this, it was as when you enter a strange house for the first time and an indefinable smell in the hallway dimly gives you a hint of things which will happen to you as if they are to be joyful things, and you feel a stab of rapture in your heart. This is one of the many words that he says is a very beautiful descriptive book. And this book was first published as a series of newspaper articles, and then these journal entries were collected and printed as a book in the Unromantic Orient. And they were originally printed in German. And in fact, this book was the very first published work of Leopold Weiss, aka Muhammad Asad. It takes us from Jerusalem to Greater Palestine, down to Cairo, back to Jerusalem, through Jordan, Syria, and Turkey. Weiss, aka Muhammad Asad, chronicles for us the Middle East in the 1920s. And he actually mentions this book in his book Road to Mecca, which is probably one of his more well-known works. He says he called this book The Unromantic East because it was a book about, not a book about the romantic, exotic, outward picture of the Muslim East, but rather an endeavor to penetrate its day-to-day realities. And it really does do that. You really get a sense that you're kind of living in the 1920s in the Middle East. His travelogue is peppered with absolutely stunning prose, the kind that instantly transports you to the place and time that he's speaking about through mere words alone. Let's take for existence his description of Port Said when he's in Egypt. And I'll read here. This is from page 20. He says, Port Said, April 2nd. She's like a stretched melody, this long line of the Suez Canal at night. The moonlight makes the waterway appear like a wide street, a dreamy, dark, metalled road. The satiated earth along the Nile Valley has very quickly given narrow passage to this waterway, though drowsy, yet certainly awake, and in all other respects looking like an evening landscape closed in on both sides of the canal. In the listening stillness, the outlines of dredging machines sometimes lift themselves into the air, or a camel rider silently whisks past, hardly seen and then swallowed by the night. The Suez Canal speaks. I want to know nothing of the politics of 3 continents. My presence is expansive and simple. I stretch from the Dead Sea to the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, through the midst of the desert, so that the waves of the Indian Ocean lap at the piers of Europe. Pretty impressive. I really enjoyed this book. And The Unromantic Orient is really a beginning of a long process of discovery for the author. Leopold Weiss, aka Muhammad Asad, he's an impressionistic young man in search of certitude. He provides beautiful descriptions, not just of the places that he's in, but his own personal disposition and kind of his feelings and the emotions that are evoked in these places. Here's another example from page 73. This is written while he's in Jordan. He's mentioned it when he wakes up in the morning. June 29th, 5 o'clock in the morning. The grayish dawn light shimmers, melting over the tents. The tents stand separately from each other in lofty independence, so that the eye can never see them all at once, and one must always cast a wide glance. It is almost like the wide open steppes. I am somewhat restless and irritated with an extraordinary kind of irritation, which cannot cling to unknown things. We are so used to clinging to things. Maybe it's because we find them hostile and dangerous, because we seek to overcome them so that they don't overrun us, because we are always distanced and always on our guard. On our guard also for our disquietude. We foolish ones, would rather seek to rid ourselves of anxiety rather than master it. And yet we get carried away in our existence, and it is deeply imprinted in our makeup that paradise is distant, and that it, just it, is in a position to bring us to the superior things. Words, thoughts, meanings speedily and fleetingly knock on the upper level of our consciousness and reveal themselves in just this manner in torment and disquiet. This was particularly moving to me because, he's describing this while he's on the edge of the desert. And it's almost kind of a prelude to what he would experience later in life when he actually goes into the depths of the Arabian Peninsula and travels there in the desert with the Bedouins. And he speaks a lot about the Bedouins and his impressions of them, a lot about kind of the prototypical Jewish people that he sees of Sephardic descent and of Yemeni descent that he meets in Israel, actually not Israel at that time, but Palestine. And, describing not only his travels, he doesn't just describe his travels, he describes the people that he meets and his impressions of them. He gives us a window into the political and the social climate of a very tumultuous time in the Middle East. And this is a very short and accessible collection of essays that will give anyone confused about the modern tensions in the Middle East insight into some of the causes and factors for what, for most of us in the West, is a mystery veiled behind propaganda, misinformation, and ignorance. I certainly was very enlightened by this book and by many of just his own prejudices, his own epiphanies, and how he dealt with them and how he explained them in such vivid imagery. Whether when he talks to us about the political situation, whether it's the British influence on Egypt and the Levant, the small yet growing Jewish presence, banking on that British favor, the waning Turkish power in the region, the rise of the Bedouins that are thrust into modernity and they're navigating this new world. Asad provides an enthralling window into, as what I said for most of us, is a mysterious world and sometimes scary. It humanizes the people that are in this book. It humanizes the people that are in the Unromantic Orient, and it really draws the reader in. The passage about Damascus brought tears to my eyes when I read it. I won't repeat it in its entirety here, but I recommend that you take a look at it. He says, when rounding out his description of that ancient city, in one of the most moving lines of the entire book, he says, "Gone like a scent in the wind, and Damascus remains silent. I will move on." I almost wish he had finished the book on this note. I can imagine someone reading this in a newspaper when it was originally printed, hoping anxiously that this was not the last installment of a long series, and feeling ultimately fulfilled even if it was. His own comments throughout the book are marked by his own self-awareness and discovery. Much like reading the words of Mark Twain, you see a man whose literary genius is apparent, but he's still struggling with his own identity. He's still struggling with his preconceived notions and prejudices of the people and the places that he's encountering. I highly recommend reading this very, very enjoyable work. I personally bought this at a bookstore. I don't even recall where. You may be able to get it online. I'll probably try and put a link in the description for you. But again, Muhammad Asad, The Unromantic Orient, I think one of the best books that I've read in English in a very, very long time. Please subscribe to the channel, hit notifications, share it if you liked it, and we'll see you with the next review.